So my name is Paul Marshall, leading the corporate crime and investigations team at Brodies. We're top rated in Scotland for our financial crime and financial services work. Banks and financial services clients are a particular focus for us, and we spend a lot of time dealing with investigations and protecting against prosecution for those clients. Delighted to have with us Oliver Powell. Ollie is ranked in Legal 500. He's a barrister with Outer Temple Chambers. He specialises in financial services regulation, business and regulatory crime, and proceeds of crime, where he's all top ranked by Legal 500 for that. His practice also involves banking disputes, regulatory enforcement action taken by the FCA and Lloyds. He's involved in a lot of internal investigation work by banks and financial institutions, and prosecutions by the FCA and SFO. He doesn't always fight, though he does a lot of good quality advisory work also, and is an editor of Millington and Sutherland Williams on proceeds of crime, and a contributor to Lysac and Horlick on bribery. James Millward, a senior associate in the Brodies corporate crime team, defends companies and individuals in the financial services sector, and has done so for a number of years, recently helping to secure a no further action result for two former Fca directors investigated by the FCA and the FRC for dishonesty in the preparation of accounts. And James has also got significant experience advising accountants being investigated by the FRC. And then we have Lisa Conroy, an associate in the team with a great deal of experience supporting clients in bribery and financial crime matters. Lisa's got a particular focus on financial services and that sector's issues, and provides advice and training to clients on strengthening their compliance regimes. So a great panel for us today, and I hope you will enjoy the conversation. We'll start then with the primary regulator in the financial services sector, the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority. And James, can I ask you to get the ball rolling? Tell us about what the FCA is, what it does, and what are its main objectives.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to be here. The FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, is the chief regulator of the financial services sector in the UK. There are a number of other regulators, but I think we're going to concentrate on the FCA today. So it's an independent regulator. I suppose that's the first point to make. A public body. It's funded unusually, I think, for regulators by those firms that it regulates by charging them fees, but is broadly accountable to the Treasury and to Parliament. So it regulates about 51,000 financial services firms and financial markets in the UK. So we're talking about banks, building societies, lenders, fintech companies, of course, investment brokers, investment funds, and advisors. And it really has three strategic objectives. The first is to protect customers. The second is to protect financial markets. And the third is to promote competition within those markets. So that means that it's responsible for maintaining market confidence and financial stability in the UK. A very, very important task, given how competitive this sector is. It's responsible for ensuring that consumers are protected in choosing products, in the products which they invest in. And for us, of course, it's the regulator which is responsible for reducing financial crime. And it does have an enforcement team which is tasked with that particular remit.
Great, thanks, James. And as you say, so as a regulator, enforcement action is one of the crucial tools or the crucial steps that the FCA can take. So let's look at that in a bit more detail with Ollie. Ollie, enforcement, a big thing for FCA. How would you characterise its strategy towards enforcement action?
Thanks, Paul. Well, in a word, selective, but I don't say that pejoratively. I think by their own admission, the FCA, we see this, come through in their handbook. It provides for an approach in terms of case selection and use of enforcement powers. So the FCA is, in my opinion, undoubtedly happier in the civil regulatory space. And in the coming years, I expect the FCA to continue to take regulatory action against FCA authorised firms under FSMA, or in some cases by imposing civil penalties under the money laundering regulations rather than prosecuting. But I don't wish to be unfairly critical, but anecdotally, I've always found the FCA rather risk adverse when it comes to mounting criminal prosecutions. And I expect that to continue. And whilst there'll always be certain cases which militate towards a criminal sanction, proceedings against the like, which, for example, we're seeing this morning, the news breaking around NatWest Bank, breaches of money laundering regulations, well, in my view, they will probably be the exception rather than the norm. So I think civil regulatory is much more where the FCA is at home.
Great. And just on that point, what is it about the comfort zone being the civil non-criminal approach? Apart from obviously the risk of not winning a prosecution or failing at trial and the publicity that might generate, is there something about the FCA as an organisation which makes it more aligned with civil rather than criminal processes?
I think probably historically that was really where they felt more comfortable, and I suppose a lot of their enforcement team had more of a civil rather than a criminal background. I think in recent years there has been some lateral hires from the Serious Fraud Office and what have you, which has undoubtedly bolstered the criminal offering, if I can put it that way, at the FCA. But I think sort of, again, drawing on some of my experience over the years, I think there's always been a sort of a bit of a nervousness or reticence about the FCA mounting criminal prosecutions. It may be because sort of taking on some of the big boys, the big banks and what have you. But, certainly the mood music, when you hear the CEO speak back in July of this year, is they want to deal with these complex fires and put them out head on. So there may be a sea change, but I think it's probably too soon to say.
Okay, great. And where are they active right now? Where are the big areas of focus for the FCA right now?
It's a good question. I mean, James has given us a very helpful reminder, really, of the three operational objectives under FSMA. I suppose in terms of consumer priorities, I think they will remain largely unchanged in the coming year. In particular, the FCA has been clear that it wants to wipe out what it calls the sludge practices. That is to say, an excessive friction that hinders consumers from making decisions in our interests by taking advantage of the sort of behavioural biases. So, for example, things like obstacles and hurdles that make it harder for consumers to switch or cancel products. I think that it has been for some time, but I think there will continue to be a focus on that. I think in terms of wholesale priorities, I think ESG and diversity are in vogue in all sectors at the moment, and FS is no different. I think the next year and beyond will undoubtedly see the FCA focusing on, probably amongst other things, tackling misleading marketing and disclosure around ESG related products. And I think this is probably given credence by a letter that was actually sent out by the FCA to authorise fund managers in July of this year. I also do think they're probably going to take a tougher approach to authorisations just generally,
yep.
With them applying probably a much greater level of intellectual rigour to the actual applicant's financials and the actual business model, and scrutinising it much closer maybe than they have done in years gone by. And probably an adjunct to this is also that I think the FCA is going to be forced, sometimes probably not out of choice, to consider how, or probably more accurately, when it's those entities which fall between the cracks in terms of the regulation. And then, sorry, last 2 points very quickly, if I may. Crypto assets, I think, as many of you know, sort of crypto assets, and it really follows from what I was just saying about those companies or institutions that fall between the cracks. UK crypto asset businesses have been required to comply with requirements of the UK money laundering regs and the register with the FCA since January. And I think the other thing, just in recent days, I think it was earlier on this week actually, the FCA published final rules which actually banned the sale of derivatives and exchange traded notes that reference certain types of crypto assets to retail customers. So I think crypto is a large topic and undoubtedly beyond the scope of this webinar, but it's undoubtedly something the FCA is going to have to grapple with, and quickly. And then finally, I think at first blush this may surprise some of you, but I think we're going to see the FCA taking a much firmer line in respect of non-financial misconduct. And I say this because I think there is a lot of sort of egregious behaviour out there in the city concerning sexual misconduct, alcohol consumption, drug use, and undoubtedly breaches of the Equality Act, which they will want to deal with head on. And I think we will probably see a few people being made example out of.
Yeah, quite right. On that last point, we've certainly been writing earlier this year, identifying the FCA's focus or interest in non-financial conduct, so to speak. So that's a great point. For just before I move on, the other thing I wanted to just flag is, for those who are excited about what the FCA may do on ESG, please do check our back catalogue. James and Lisa were waxing lyrical on that very issue in a session last week, so there's a lot more in there to look at. What we'll do now before we move on is I wanted to bring a poll up, so the team in the background, if they could pull this poll up for us. This is looking at the FCA's enforcement activity and just trying to gauge where we are. So the question is, what was the total amount of fines handed down by the FCA in 2020? So please do have a look. We've got less than 100 million, 101 to 150, 150 to 200 million, and more than 200 million. What was the total amount of fines handed down by the FCA in 2020? Yeah, okay, well, I'm just going to call the shot on it there. Dawn, if we can freeze it there. So what we've got, 29% saying less than 100 million, 7% 101 to 150, 29% 150 to 200, more than 200 million, 36%. So the majority think more than 200 million. The correct answer is 192 million. So there's the winner there. The 4 or 29% of people who picked more than 150 but less than 200, you get that right. Now, follow-up poll to compare that with the previous year. So Don, if we could pull up the next poll, was that figure of 192 million, was this more, less, or about the same as the 2019 level of fines recovered? So we've got not quite a 50-50 split. We've got the majority think that that was more than 2019, and then there's a smaller contingent for the other two. The interesting point there is, no, it's substantially less. 2019, the level of fines was 392 million. So in other words, 200 million more in fines were recovered in 29 as compared to 2020. Now, just before we move on, just pausing on that for a second, what does that tell us? James, do you want to give us your view now? What does that tell us, the fact that in 2019 we're 390 odd million in fines, we're 200 million down in 2020? Does that point to less activity from the FCA or less pursuit of substantially large organisations? What's the answer there?
I think the figures are always skewed by very large fines. So if you have a fine of 90 million or 100 million, then it may be that one year is particularly disproportionate. It doesn't mean that there haven't been the same number of cases, for example, investigated and opened. What I would say is that the FCA have recently said that they want to open more cases. In fact, they've been saying that over the last couple of years, and they have been doing so. There is no direct correlation between the number of cases they're opening and the level of enforcement activity that we're seeing. So the fact that they're opening more cases doesn't mean that they're actually taking them through and prosecuting.
Yeah, and indeed, the larger the number doesn't necessarily mean there's lots more cases being brought forward. Ollie, what's your take on it? I'm interested in the sense of, is there more or less enforcement action between 2019 and 2020? And indeed, in the current year, we're a good bit through 2021 now, but do we think that trend is going to carry on downwards, or do we think there's going to be a ramping up of activity?
I think obviously we have to appreciate 2020 was the sort of first year of COVID, and I think, you know, the FCA were, to use that sort of civil servant phrase, were firefighting, and I think a lot of their bandwidth was probably being taken up with you know, fraud around COVID related fraud. Yeah. And I know actually from you know, matters I've been involved in, that there's been a number of large investigations they've been involved in as well. So I think that probably will have had a sort of an impact.
Yeah, great. All right, so well, I'm mindful that we've got on the session today a range of attendees from across the UK, and in some ways you'd be tempted to think that the FCA's enforcement powers are almost identical across the UK, but in fact there is a key difference for FCA activity, enforcement activity north of the border. Now, Lisa, I wondered, could you pick this up for us? When we say there's a key difference for the FCA when they're acting in Scotland, what's the difference between the north of the border and the rest of the UK?
Thanks, Paul. Yes, so I think the key difference is, if we think about investigatory powers on the one hand and prosecutorial powers on the other. So in Scotland, if the FCA is investigating, it would require to report to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and it would be for the Crown Office to make a decision on whether to bring criminal proceedings. But in England, of course, the FCA itself has power to take a decision to bring a prosecution, as well as to initiate and run those proceedings.
Yeah, great. And Ollie, just from your perspective, that added filter in Scotland of the FCA requiring to have the Crown take the reins and bring the prosecution forward, do you think, is that likely to lead to less activity north of the border, or do we think the Crown are very likely to respect the views of the FCA if an enforcement is recommended to be a prosecution?
I think my own take, and maybe drawing on other areas of my workload as well, I don't think it's probably less enforcement per se, but I think it often by the Crown and Procurator Fiscal, there's more of a delay. So that's probably what I would expect. And obviously one of the, as I think many of us will know on this webinar, one of the FCA's big thing at the moment is being more expeditious in how they address matters and being more decisive in their action taking. So I think that will be interesting. Maybe, potential friction there between the FCA and the Crown in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that occurs to me certainly is your point at the beginning around being apprehensive about the idea of running criminal cases that you may not win, or just the FCA being more traditionally a civil litigation or civil enforcement organisation. There's a nice option there of, well, we'll just pass the criminal risk over to the prosecution authority in Scotland. Of course, if the case has a basis for being in Scotland. But you could see that there would be a nice way for the FCA to pass on that criminal trial risk, I suppose. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I touched on earlier, I think the standard of proof, inevitably, if you're looking at a particular investigation, a money laundering investigation being a good one, and you're somewhere sort of sat on the fence, and it's going to be easier to get over the line because of the balance of probabilities, the lower threshold, then I suppose it depends on your appetite for risk. But I think you're right. It's a good point. I probably don't know enough about how it works in Scotland to comment authoritatively, but I think it's a valid point.
Well, we can do that bit. That's fine. Don't worry. So moving on. So let's move into looking at an FCA investigation. So we know the FCA can investigate individuals and companies, of course. Ollie, could you give us a sense of the types of cases that the FCA are focused on? What are the key failures or key breaches they're picking up?
Yeah, of course. And before I do that, just for some people that aren't aware, the FCA, they can actually undertake a civil investigation, a criminal investigation, or what they call a dual track investigation. And the dual track approach, it's been commonplace for some time now in relation to market abuse investigations, but it's becoming increasingly adopted in relation to suspected AML system and compliance issue breaches. And I think that's quite important, because if you're sort of, dealing with a certain situation, it may well be you're on the dual track. And I think, really going back to basics, every day the UK relies on a range of financial services, from basic bank accounts to car loans, mortgages to pensions, complex investment products. So I think, given the same, civil breaches, insofar as the FCA are concerned, are diverse and non-exhaustive, whilst criminality in the FS sector is equally varied. And the offences usually fall under FSMA, and they cover really a whole manner of sins. It could be, for example, carrying on regulated activity without authorisation or exemption. It could be making a false claim to be authorised or exempt, breach of a prohibition notice, quite common, breach of listing rules. But perhaps the more serious of the offences, which are not covered by FSMA, but are available in the FCA's toolbox, as it were, are insider dealing under Part 5 of the Criminal Justice Act, and of course money laundering offences under POCA. And I think it's probably finally worth pointing out at this juncture that whilst the FS has access to those particular types of offending behaviour, very often the FCA will work with its partners, that is to say the SFO, BIS, CMA, TPR, ICO and others. And I think they all recognise that there are areas where their functions and powers overlap. But in relation to criminal matters, I think the FCA Enforcement Guide provides that agencies must endeavour to ensure that whichever agency has the most appropriate function, and indeed powers, should have primacy. So just by way of brief example, where the conduct alleged, say, relates to market confidence or protection of FS consumers, the FCA is most likely to retain primacy. But conversely, where there is serious or complex fraud alleged, it's more likely that the SFO will have their hand on the tiller.
Yeah, that makes sense. And going back to your point earlier, I suppose in terms of the strengths of the FCA, is there a simple conclusion to draw that, for example, compared to the SFO, that the FCA has particular strengths and weaknesses, and the SFO's strengths and weaknesses are in another place, or is that too simplistic?
No, I think it ties in really with what I was just alluding to. I think in terms of FS technical knowledge, I think the FCA has a skill set and a requisite knowledge which the SFO just simply doesn't have. But then conversely, the SFO deals with high value, multi-party, multi-jurisdictional, fraud and bribery, corruption. And of course, in particular fraud, there may be certain parts with the FCA who maybe don't have that exposure or insight or experience of dealing with high-level fraud.
Yeah, great.
Paul, if I could just jump in here, I think Ollie has presented quite a rosy picture of how things should work. In my experience, they don't work like that in practice very often. For example, the FCA has a memorandum of understanding with the FRC, and they are supposed to cooperate closely on investigations which both investigators are involved in. I have been on cases where it's very clear that the FCA hasn't received information which I have provided to the FRC on behalf of my clients. And likewise, information provided to the FCA hasn't been provided to the FRC. I retain a degree of skepticism about the dual track approach, because I think the FCA often opens a dual track investigation because they want to use the powers which a criminal investigation will give them in order to procure information which they otherwise wouldn't be able to get. And I think it's not a secret. I mean, Mark Stewart has been very open in wanting to open as many investigations as possible and using the powers that the FCA has as a tool to investigation. And there's every scope, I think, to challenge that sort of approach if you do have a dual track and you don't think that it's appropriate.
Well, interesting, James, a really helpful contribution. And what I wanted to ask you next was, so in your experience, are you seeing a sort of standard modus operandi of how an investigation is conducted? So you're critical of the concept of the dual track being used maybe in more circumstances than ought to be. Can you tell us, are you identifying that there's a standard form of investigation process that you see the FCA taking time and time again?
Well, the FCA, I mean, they do have a standard protocol they have to follow. I mean, they will issue a notice of appointment of investigators, for example. There is the opportunity to have scoping interviews with the FCA and the FRC as well, if the FRC is involved. There is a standard approach to the way that investigations are carried out. I think the part of the investigation which gives us as advisors and our clients most opportunity to challenge and to push back is when you get to the interview stage. And I'm sure we'll come to this, but one of my, I suppose, tips, if you like, is to be quite patient about the FCA process until you get to that interview stage, because you really don't know very often the cards that the FCA holds. You don't know their hand until you are presented with the evidence at interview. And it may take many, many months. I mean, the last case I did, it actually took 18 months before the FCA brought in my clients for interview. All right,
okay, good. Now, Lisa, that's James taking us much further into the body of an investigation. Let's go right back to the beginning. FCA conducting an investigation, your client gets notice of that. Is there a choice not to cooperate? Can you turn your back on the FCA? Is that a smart idea?
I think the short answer is no. And I'm sure we'll come on to speak in more detail a bit later on about the FCA's powers to compel compliance. But where the FCA is acting under those criminal powers, failure to comply can involve a criminal offence in itself, which could lead to separate criminal proceedings. And if in that event, those separate proceedings are very likely to be concluded before any formal action arising from the substantive investigation. So a conviction for failure to comply could not only result in a separate criminal conviction, but could also give rise to an adverse impact on the substantive matter.
Yeah, so indeed, so as you say, there isn't really a choice to refuse when the criminal powers are being relied upon, and we're back into James's world of being patient and cooperative. Maybe look more at that in a minute. So but Lisa, one other thing I wanted to hear from you on at this stage is, when the FCA is considering whether to pursue an investigation, what factors do they take into account? What's in their decision-making process there?
So I think the starting point is that they have a very broad discretion when considering to open an investigation, and the thresholds for doing so are relatively low. In general, an investigation can be opened where there are circumstances suggesting misconduct, or in the case of authorised firms, where there's simply a good reason for doing so. I think some of the factors that the FCA will consider when deciding whether to take action include the nature and the severity of any actual or potential harm caused by the conduct of concern, whether there are any wider or broader implications for the market, for instance, whether the conduct of concern may be a common issue in the market, or whether there's a risk that the market could be distorted. Other considerations include whether there's any actual or potential impact on vulnerable consumers, or whether the conduct of concern has given rise to any fitness and propriety issues. And of course, Ollie was mentioning earlier on the FCA's increased focus on non-financial misconduct. We've seen a lot of action in that respect over recent months.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Now, I'm going to, in my mind, to jump a couple of steps and like something that James flagged I wanted to pick up with Ollie on. So James talking about the dual track process. Ollie, what I wanted to come into next, if we can, is, are there standard powers that we see the FCA relying upon time and again for investigations? In other words, would you literally be able to predict they're going to rely on this power, they're going to do this, they're going to do that as they commence an investigation?
Yeah, to a degree there is. I mean, they have an array of tools in their investigative armory, but I mean, insofar as disclosure of information or documents is concerned, they can, by written notice, require an authorised person to provide information or documentation, as Lisa's just touched upon. And interesting, I think the power of the FCA to require disclosure also extends to persons or entities connected with the authorised persons. I think that's always very, very interesting. Another thing that really I think is something just important to flag up is documents can also be disclosed under compulsion, and even those documents are obtained under compulsion, the documents themselves can be used in criminal proceedings. Naturally, when the FCA, in terms of search and seizure, they don't have a sort of a power unless they actually obtain a warrant from a magistrates court in England and Wales and a sheriff's court in Scotland. And then in terms of interviews, really, which is the other one, they will interview your client, whether it's a civil or a criminal investigation. Naturally, when your client is suspected of committing a criminal offence, the interview will be under caution. So PACE and the Code of Practice will apply, and obviously the criminal procedure under the Scotland Act and those protections. So I think to a degree there are the similar sort of, it won't take anyone as surprise. There are methods of obtaining documents. There are interviews. So I think it's a well-trodden path, if I can put it that way, whether it's civil or criminal, and whether it's in Scotland or in England and Wales.
Yeah, that's great, Ollie. And that point around compelled documents, compelled from one person or entity, then being used against other persons or entities, is just a constant pattern and headache, I suppose. There's not really a way around that, is there?
No, there isn't, and it's very interesting, and it comes up time and time again, because where the FCA compels a suspect to attend an interview, any statement that they give in a compelled interview can't be used in criminal proceedings. But the one caveat to that is that answers that are given in a compelled interview can be used in an FCA prosecution for failing to cooperate or giving false information. So it goes full circle to what you're asking James and Lisa about, and indeed also to misleading the FCA. So, you know, powers of compulsion, they are very draconian powers, but the FCA are not alone. You know, there are a number of organisations who have those powers.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, always the...
Sorry.
So, James, I was just going to say, also flags the point to us that it's so important that in an FCA investigation where you have entities and individuals with separate interests, that the organisation really does focus on thinking about making sure that individuals have independent legal representation in those circumstances, because very often the idea of having aligned interests, they separate very quickly, or they separate much later in the day, but inevitably they do separate. But James, sorry, you were going to come in with something.
I was just going to come in and mention the issue of transparency. In my experience, the transparency of the FCA, the willingness to update you on the progress of the investigation and the scope of the investigation, while that should be something which is mandated, if the scope changes, the FCA should update you and your clients. I have found that varies quite a lot. So some investigators will be prepared to have conversations with you about the investigation. Other investigators will not enter into any conversations at all.
Right.
James, your experience mirrors my own in that regard. I think it really does depend who the investigator case controller is.
Good. So it's not just James is upsetting all the FCA personnel. Good. Right. Bringing our section to the end, I'm going to turn, because we have a couple of questions from the audience. Please do chip in with some more questions, audience members, before we come to the end. But I'm going to come the next couple of minutes. We'll bring the formal or the structured part of the session to the end. I want to get to that practical point of key protective steps an organisation or individual can take if they're under investigation by the FCA. And I want to really go around the table for views on this. So I'm looking for, from each of you, one or two key pieces of advice that you would give to an individual or an organisation facing investigation. And Lisa, can I start with you on that one, and then we'll go around?
Sure, thanks, Paul. So I think the key thing we recommend to clients is being proactive. In the early phases, it really is about managed engagement and trying to get an understanding of what the concerns are, and taking steps internally within the business to understand whether there's any evidence which can be presented to allay those concerns. But I think overall the key message is managed and strategic cooperation, because as we've seen time and again, the FCA really does value cooperation, and that can be reflected in the ultimate outcome of a case.
Great, thanks, Lisa. James, what have you got as your top tips if you're under investigation?
I wouldn't deviate from what Lisa says. I think cooperation is a fundamental tenet. I would add to that there is a sophisticated way to be proactive, and it's not always in the client's best interests to be chasing the FCA, to be trying to put yourself on the front foot with the FCA, because there are situations where patience is really the greatest virtue. I have acted for clients where the FCA has been very dilatory, very slow, and we have got to the stage where we've made representations about the length of time it's taken to investigate, and no further action has been taken. On the other hand, I have had clients who are very adamant that they have a case to put forward and wanted us to push the FCA at every opportunity to justify their hand. I think clients need to remember that the burden of proof is on the regulator. The regulator has to tell you what they are investigating and provide evidence for you to comment on. So frustrating though it is, and it can be extraordinarily frustrating if you're 3 years down the line into an investigation, you really do need to wait for the regulator to show its hand before you.
So I'm going to, that's helpful, James. For Ollie, for you, I'm going to completely twist that view of James's for a second and say, obviously the concept of self-reporting and volunteering wrongdoing to regulators will often lead to a reduction in penalties, will mitigate what the outcomes would otherwise be. One strategy is the James, what I call the James strategy here, of being patient and waiting to understand what you're facing. Is there an advantage to an organisation which has understood or identified itself a breach to walk forward and tell the story to the FCA? Is that ever a sensible thing to do, and what can that lead to?
I think in the financial services sector, there is usually an obligation to report. I think it's a little bit different, say, contrast that maybe to the Serious Fraud Office, where you uncover something, and of course it may not hit the materiality threshold, but I think usually there is an obligation in the FS sector anyway. But if you wanted to be, playing devil's advocate for a moment maybe, and sort of not, I agree with what James and Lisa are advocating, but actually sometimes controlling the narrative at an early stage of an investigation is incredibly important. And if you think you genuinely have got a very good defence, or you can actually put forward quite a compelling case to actually almost make the regulator second guess themselves, then there is merit. But of course, you've got to front load your work on getting that out there early doors. And almost, because they'll be having the same conversations you're having, strategizing, and they might actually not fancy it, and they may think, not sure about this. So,
right. Okay, excellent. All right, so thank you all so far for your really helpful contributions. I'm now going to turn to the audience questions and pick up a couple of those in the last 5 minutes before we finish up. So first question we have in, do you think the FCA is making enough use of technology to advance its investigations and take decisive action? Ollie, I'll start with you on that. Is the FCA using technology in an effective way when it's investigating?
I think it's an excellent question. No is the honest answer, but in all fairness to the FCA, I think they know that, and in my opinion, they are taking steps to address it. The criticisms of their handling of London Capital and Finance and Connaught are well documented, and I think they've probably acted as a shot across the bows for the FCA. So I think it's fair to say that a lot of companies, not just the FCA, are becoming more in tune with data and how they collect it and how they use it. And I think the FCA, in particular, specifically applying it to financial investigations, everything the FCA does is subject to the data it collects, how it interprets it, and how it uses it. So I think, once they get to grips with that, and I know that the CEO, I forget the number they put on it, I think it was something like 120 million. They are investing a substantial amount of money in the next 3 years. I think they're hoping to modernise their systems because that will allow them to interrogate the data more expeditiously, thereby allowing them to act more decisively. So I think no, but I think they are working on it.
Great. I think that nails it, James, Lisa, unless either of you have got a very strongly different view that there's fantastic use of technology right now.
Well, the one thing the FCA can't be criticised for is a lack of announcements on this issue, because they've certainly issued a number of announcements about new initiatives. The other angle that I just would pick up on is I don't think they have any choice. I mean, the number of cyber incidents is increasing dramatically each year. If they are seriously going to tackle cybercrime, then they need to have a technological framework in place which is at least as good as the malefactors.
Thanks, James. I'm just going to say I'm shocked you've not referred to your favourite FCA tool, the sandbox. I'm amazed you didn't squeeze that in this discussion. Anyway, I'm not going to let you squeeze it in now, though. We're going to move on to the next question. So the next one, I like this one a lot, actually. What do you consider to be the most significant FCA case in the last 3 years, and why? Ollie, what have you got? What stands out for you as a key or significant case in the last couple of years?
I think probably it's actually a recent case where the FCA issued a prohibition notice against a gentleman called Mr. Frencham, and it was based on his conviction for an offence which, funny enough, didn't involve financial fraud or dishonesty. And the upper tribunal concluded that the conviction alone was insufficient to make a prohibition order, but actually the FCA's decision was nonetheless upheld due to Mr. Frencham's failure to basically be open and transparent with the FCA during the course of the criminal investigation and latter regulatory proceedings brought by the CII, I think it was. And they said, ergo, he lacked integrity. And I think the tribunal's judgment really provides sort of essential guidance both to the FCA and also to firms when assessing an individual's fitness under the the senior managers and certification regime. So I think it's actually quite an important case, really, albeit it's nowhere near as high level as others.
That's great. It's the Watergate case, though. It's the idea of the cover-up's what gets you in the end.
Yeah, quite.
Yeah. James, do you have any other excellent FCA action you wanted to flag to us before we close?
The key data case comes to mind. I can't remember what year that was, 2 or 3 years ago, maybe. 2 individuals were charged, a very antagonistic case. It was in the upper tribunal for 6 weeks, I think, and it was very acrimonious. I think that the facts were that you had 2 individuals who had issued products to consumers in the UK. Those products were empty products, but the individuals were charging very significant fees on those products, and made, I think, in excess of 70 million. So they had the resources to challenge the FCA to fight this to the nth degree. But the FCA held on doggedly, and both individuals were fined at 70 odd million, so they managed to recoup the damage that was done. That was quite an important case, I think, because it just shows the lengths to which the FCA is prepared to go, even where they're confronted by quite truculent and difficult characters, to recover money and to prosecute.
Great. Really good. What we'll do when we post out after the event, the details, the link to the event, we'll make sure that we give the audience the links to each of those cases to read them at their leisure, and they can let us know if you agree with us or not that these are exciting, important cases. But I really appreciated hearing from all 3 of you on that question. We're at the 45-minute point. I wanted to stop on time, so I think all that remains for me to say is thanks to Ollie and to James and to Lisa for their contribution this afternoon. I've really enjoyed hosting the discussion. Thanks to all of you who have attended the session. After the session, we'll make it available both on the Brodies website and through the usual social media channels. So you've got the chance to go back and drill into any of James's controversial comments, any of Ollie's informative comments, or any of Lisa's really practical advice about dealing with investigations. But until then, thanks all for your time and have a good afternoon.